It's a great pleasure and honour to be able to interview you today, David Brokenshaw. David, when were you born and where?
In May 1923, near Durban, a small seaside town, Winklespruit, the English called it.
How do you spell Winklespruit?
Winklespruit. It means the river by the shop, but the English mispronounce it.
What do they call it?
Winklespruit. It should be Winkelspruit.
Right. And tell me something about your parents.
Father was a solicitor, later an advocate and later a judge. His father had come out from Cornwall in 1870. My mother came from Lancashire as a nursing sister, and they married in 1915, and I was the youngest of three sons.
And did either of them have a great influence on you, their character or their advice or admonitions?
Both, yes. Looking back, I had one of those dull, happy childhoods with little drama. I think I'd say for my mother, a concern for the poor. She had done her nursing training in the slums of Edinburgh about the turn of the century, and she said some of the conditions there were as bad as anything she saw in South Africa. And I remember one incident when I wanted a puppy and was given one, and my dad insisted that I clean up after the puppy and look after him, which I wanted to do anyway, and it was only later that he didn't want me to leave it to the boy, as they say in South Africa. And although it's embarrassing now to look back on this privileged white South African childhood, at the time I have no memories of horrid incidents.
Yes.
I grew up as one did in the 1920s, in a white milieu.
Were you aware of the fact that there was another world of black people in poverty and so on around you?
Not very much. Through the servants, we liked to go. The Fanyan, our Zulu servant, had a little outbuilding, and we liked to sit there. I can still remember the smell, the closed hut, the tobacco, which was exciting to us. And vaguely, but I can't say I had any tender social conscience. It wasn't until I joined the army later that I became more aware.
What was your father like? Was he was obviously a prestigious legal person.
But no, he was good. He was a good daddy. He was advised to do some manual work, and he started building canoes, and which he built one for all of us. We helped him. And so I remember my happiest memories of my boyhood were on Durban Bay. We had a cottage in Salisbury Island, which is now built over. So he looked after us well. Once when I was with him in a yacht, we were being swept out, I thought, to sea in a westerly buster, and we clambered onto a large buoy about 8 foot. And I remember asking whether we would be saved, and he put his arm around me and said, "Don't worry, son, we'll be all right." And we were, of course, we were rescued. He wasn't demonstrative. He wasn't a huggy-kissy man, but he was there. I knew that all the time.
And what about your mother?
Yes, very much there. She did not, after marriage, she did not work. Another very important member of our family was Lizzie, Elizabeth Calderwood, who was a
How do you spell her name?
Calderwood. Her father had come out from Glasgow as a Presbyterian minister. Lizzie was 21, and she joined our household, I think, because my mother had lost her first baby, and that was when she was 37 years old. My mother was 11 years older than my dad, and by the time I was born, she was 45, but I survived, and Lizzie was a major figure. She was always there. She was there for 6 years, but I remember she told me when I met her, when she was an old lady, that I cried when she left because I said she should stay with me 12 years. She had been 12 years with Guy, my eldest brother.
I see. Right, and then moving on to school, where did you go to school?
To local schools, to the Durban Preparatory High School, and then to the Durban High School, which then had 350 boys, all white at that time. It was a good school, produced some good people. Philip Tobias, the paleontologist, was there. He remembered me, but he was 2 years below me, so in those times I didn't bother with the boys below me. And I had there the advantage of a remarkable English teacher. I edited the school magazine and I was secretary of the debating society, and Neville Nuttall, this teacher, supervised me in these efforts and encouraged me. N-U-T-T. N-U-T-T-A-L-L. One of his sons became a well-known bishop in the Anglican Church in South Africa. And many years later, in 1951, I came out from Oxford, and I was travelling on the Union Castle line with Evans Pritchard and his family. My mother was with me at the time, and she was friendly with the owner, Evans Pritchard, so we had arranged this, and also on the ship was Neville Nuttall, and I felt that was a neat conjunction, that the two most important mentors in my life met and were together.
So how did he influence you, having Neville Nuttall?
Literature, obviously, making me more aware in a very gentle way, and also I think by example, a gentleman, an intelligent, strong gentleman, showing me you didn't have to be loud and noisy and vulgar to be strong, to have strength.
And what age were you at this time?
15, 16. I was 16 when I left school, and then I went, this was in 1940, I went to Rhodes University College, as it then was, in Grahamstown, for only 2 terms. I was really too young, too immature at 16. I remember very little of that time, apart from the excitement of being away from home, being at university. And then in July of 1940, my middle brother, Paul, had dropped out of school. He was a juvenile delinquent, really, and had come back to school, to another school, to Maritzburg College. And in July 1940, with the war on, Paul and I joined the, as they called it, there was no draft in South Africa. Our eldest brother, Guy, was then quite an air ace. He had joined in 1937 the Fleet Air Arm, and already he'd been decorated and had done all sorts of heroic things, been shot down twice, once by friendly fire, and had survived. And Paul and I wanted to be a pilot like Guy, but I was only 17, they wouldn't take me. And in the army they were supposed to be 18, but they were less fussy, and Paul and I joined as dispatch riders, having been promised Harley Davidsons, which at age 17 was irresistible, to have a brand new Harley Davidson motorbike and to ride as fast as I liked.
Yes.
Shall I go on with the war?
Yes.
We had a year in South Africa in training at Potchefstroom, and just digressing for a moment, in Potchefstroom was Potchefstroom. Potchefstroom had an Afrikaans university and was one of the heartlands of the nationalists who were pro-German, who were against South Africa coming in the war, and there were some quite unpleasant fights between the local people and the soldiers, at that time we had 2 national anthems, Die Stem van Suid-Afrika, which was the Afrikaans one, and God Save the King, as it was then. And the local people would refuse to stand for God Save the King, and then there would be an all-out fight afterwards. Not nice. After 1 year in training, we went to North Africa with the 2nd South African Division and spent a year in the desert. And then the whole division pretty much was captured. 22,000 South Africans were captured in June 1942 at Tobruk. And it was only then, until then, we'd had a fairly easy war, but it was only those few days before our capture when we were attacked and machine gunned, and some of my mates were killed, and Paul and I were taken prisoner. Spent 6 months in North Africa, in Tahuna, which is about 35 miles south of Tripoli, in the desert, and that was quite rough. We were short.
Prisoner of war camp.
Prisoner of war camp run by the Italians. When we were caught, Paul and I were both strong swimmers, and before we were caught we had decided to go to the coast. We were very close, wait till nightfall and swim, we thought 5-8 miles outside the perimeter of Tobruk, where we thought we would meet our forces. We didn't realize that they were 80 miles away, advancing on the Germans. Rommel was advancing on Alexandria. So when we were caught, we'd had a bottle of gin between 7 of us. We'd had our share, and I'd taken off my shorts. I only had shorts and a shirt, and was in a pool sleeping when some Germans came round. Very dramatic, because I made a dive for my shorts, and they thought I was going for a gun, and there was a burst just above my head. And then typically, many other prisoners reported the same. They apologized, the Germans, for handing us over to the Italians. You and I are soldiers, they are not. Anyway, Tahuna for 6 months, and then taken to Frascati, north of Rome, for 15 months. Escaped in the Italian armistice, got caught again after 11 days, and taken to Germany, to Dresden, and were put in a camp. Paul was a sergeant, I was a lance corporal, but my dad had asked us to stay together, so he volunteered to come to the working camp, where he was the senior Allied prisoner of war, and I worked in the German post office loading parcels. Under the Geneva Convention respecting prisoners of war, it's permissible to work as long as it's not direct war work, and in fact it would have been boring just to stay in camp all the time, and we had our own ways of making the time pass, and generally got on well with the German civilians who were supervising us and the German guards.
Did you speak German?
I spoke a little. I became very friendly with Wolfgang, one of the guards, my age. I used to try and talk to him in German and he to me in English, and we would talk about our plans for going to university after the war. And I only realized afterwards, because this is an important part of my personal history, that I was in love with Wolfgang. I didn't recognize until I was 31 years old, and I met Bernard, who became my life partner, when I was 31. I would not recognize that I was gay. Wolfgang and I had a very close relationship, and there were many of these relationships, unusual between a German and a Brit, but many of them had homoerotic elements, although there was no physical expression. And I was very distressed when Dresden was bombed. That was in February the 13th, 14th, 1945. I was desperate to see Wolfgang. I was more concerned about him than about the 20,000 people who had been killed. And when he saw me, he said to me in German, don't speak to me again. And I was told by Horst, the camp commandant, that Wolfgang's sister's flat had been bombed and she had been killed, and his nephew, so I could understand.
How close were you to the bombing?
We were 8 kilometers from the center of Dresden, so there was no direct bombing, but we could see it. The RAF bombed by night and the United States Air Force by day. And going through the town later, I thought I would never get the stench out of me, and even there are times in East Africa after the rains there's a certain putrid smell which takes me back unpleasantly to Dresden. And there were signs all over town in German, who loots will be shot, and we saw Mr. Christensen, the Red Cross representative, a Dane. He came round and he warned us that he couldn't protect us if anybody looted, and there would be photographs both of Germans and Belgians who had been caught looting. And at that time a number of Americans came into our camp, and they were in very poor condition. They'd been captured in the Ardennes and brought there, and one of them looted and was caught, and my brother went to his trial and said there was nothing he could do. He was found guilty and shot. I should move on because I'll spend all the time on the war. The prisoner of war period was important to me. I remember thinking, after the war I'm not going to be pushed around. we didn't suffer much unpleasantness. Once in North Africa I was slapped by a sentry who thought I had insulted him, but that was a sting, it wasn't awful. But I didn't like being young and proud, I didn't like being pushed around, and I can't say I've been able to do that all the time, but there are times when I still think I don't have to put up with this, whether it's academic cruelty and pomposity or just bureaucratic hurdles. So in a way it's been good for me, and also it was good. I went back as soon as I could. We were demobilized and sent to Britain and then to South Africa. My father, by the way, was in Britain. He was a judge by then, and he was chairman of a South African Prisoners of War Relatives Association. When Paul and I saw him in Brighton, where the camp was, he was trying to telephone in the days when you still used pennies, and Paul said, "Don't waste your pennies, Pop, we're here." And it's one of the few times when he hugged us. So we went back to South Africa. I went back, got back in July, and I wanted to join the Air Force. I still had this, it's taken me years to get over this, a shame and embarrassment. I thought I should have been a hero, like Guy, my eldest brother, who had disappeared off his aircraft carrier in 1942, the same time when we were captured. He was never seen again. And fortunately, really the atomic bomb was dropped in August, so that made it unnecessary. But I can remember Paul's fiancée, later his wife, being furious with me for wanting this. Then I went back to Rhodes University and was able to finish a degree in 2 years. They had acceleration. And then, and this,
what was the subject?
I did political science and economy. I thought I had ideas. By then I was quite aware. I'd started during the army years, and I was quite aware of the problems in South Africa, and I thought that if I could become familiar with economics, I could persuade the whites that it was not only morally right, but economically to their benefit to loosen up on blacks. Then I applied for an L.C. Bellot scholarship. One or two were awarded each year to Cambridge. They're similar in value and conditions to the L-C-E-L-S-I-E and then B-A-L-L-O-T. L.C. Bellot was the widow of two men who had both been very rich mining tycoons, and she'd left her money for these scholarships. They accumulated during the war. The trustee said it would be unfair when so many of our boys, as they called it, were in the army. 8 were awarded in 1947, and I was given the 8th. In those days they announced number 1, number 2. And I think there were two things in my favour. One particularly, that I'd been a prisoner of war, and they felt sorry, the trustees felt sorry for me. And two, although I was hopeless at rugby and cricket, which are very important for these sort of things, I was a fair swimmer. I had swam for Natal under 15s, and that pulled me through. And without that scholarship, I certainly would not be here now. That changed my life. I didn't know where I was going, really. I had started in my last year at Oxford, at Rhodes, I had started anthropology courses, first of all with J.D. Krieger, that's K-R-I-G-E, who wrote The Realm of the Rain Queen about the Levedu and what was then Northern Transvaal, and his wife Eileen Jensen Krieger, who'd written about the Zulu. And then shortly after that, Monica Wilson was appointed, and I was one of her first students.
What was she like?
Terrific. She really was. She was another major influence on me. The last article that I wrote, which has just been published in the South African Journal, was based on a lecture I gave on the annual Monica Wilson lecture at the University of Cape Town on her ideas about social change, and how for her period, she had been a student of Malinowski, she was one who didn't blot out the outboard motors and the schools and the trading stores. She took everything head on as she saw it, and that was a major influence on me. It appealed to me. I was attracted to anthropology because I thought in a country like South Africa it offered some sort of answers to what could be done. I still think that is true. She also influenced me because on Sunday evenings she would ask a few of us round to supper. Murray Carlin, who became a lecturer in English, and Hamish Dickey Clark, sociologist, were my close friends, and we went several times. And when I myself became a teacher at the University of California, Bernard and I made a regular habit of having students, undergraduates and graduate students, to our home on Sunday patio lunches, and I know how much it meant to them. And it was Monica who started this informal meeting. Her son, Francis Wilson, is a very well-known economist in South Africa, director of a research institute, and I saw him a few weeks ago, and he remembered me when he was aged about 8, hiding under the table to hear our conversation.
So you did some anthropology in your last year.
Yes.
And you were getting interested in it. Why did you decide to go to Oxford?
To Cambridge.
Or Cambridge?
Because of the scholarship. The scholarship was offered. I knew very little about it, and I knew nothing of the Judge Caney, who was a friend of my dad's, had been at Christ College, and he told my dad that I should apply there. So I didn't know one college from another, but they accepted me. Fortunately, I had done Latin in my matric, which was essential then, and I was accepted at Christ. And for the first year, I read the economics tripos. I still thought that I would like to become an economist and go back to South Africa and help build a nation. We were supposed to, under the terms of the scholarship, we were supposed to go back to some sort of public service. I did well enough, and I had a very good tutor in economics, but it didn't really grab my imagination, and I met some, I shifted and I did part 2 of the tripos in social anthropology. And there I met Paul Baxter, with whom I'm still in touch. I will be seeing him next week. And also David Pocock. At that time there were only 6 of us doing the tripos, and 3 of us, Pocock and Baxter and I, went on to do graduate work, postgraduate work at Oxford, because Cambridge was really in the doldrums. Haddon was professor.
What year was this?
1949.
Yeah. Haddon couldn't have been professor.
Hutton, sorry. And the only faculty member I remember with clearly was Reo Fortune,
Yes.
who was both a very dramatic man, and again he and his wife Mildred invited us out. This was very important. We used to cycle out to Duck End in a muddy lane for Sunday tea, and the tea was always welcome. Post-war rationing was in force. I mean, Mildred gave us nice cakes, but it was more talking to these remote academics in an informal atmosphere, and Reo was never informal, and his lectures were spellbinding.
They were supposed to be very difficult to follow sometimes.
They were. It was like following a movie where the plot wasn't clear, and sometimes when he was talking about headhunting, we wondered if he had carried participant observation too far, because we got the impression that he was there with the Dyaks throwing spears. But it was certainly something that you remembered. And
who were your sort of supervisors? Who in supervisions? Was it Reo or was it?
Was it Peristiani?
John Peristiani was there, wasn't he?
And then he also moved to Oxford.
Yes. And were you taught by Hutton?
I think we went. He wasn't very impressive.
No, it was his last year, wasn't it?
Yes, and we also did some archaeology and some physical anthropology. It was very far removed from the American Four Fields, but we did a smattering, and we went out on a dig for Roman coins and that sort of thing. But I remember more my own contemporaries, and I met then Godfrey Lienhardt, who came over from Oxford, and he was another important influence, both in terms of anthropology and in terms of, he was the first Roman Catholic that I got to know well. He and his friend Talok Davis, who went on to become Attorney General in Malaysia.
Is that T-A-L?
T-A-L-O-G-D-A-V-I-E-S, Welsh obviously. And they came, they had friends at Cambridge. I met them several times. Unusual to me because I had associated Catholics with rather peasant Italians and Irish, and not the sort of thing I'd be interested in. And Godfrey was one of the brightest men I ever met. And as well as that, he and Talloch were Catholics, but they could joke about it. They were relaxed. They weren't like my Methodist grandfather, who was very strict, so much so that all his sons, including my own father, were agnostic and had no religion. And as a result of that, I started going to Father Gilby, later Monsignor Gilby, who was the Catholic chaplain at the time, quite well known. And I moved to Oxford, as I said, in the graduate year, and I finished instruction at Oxford and was received there, with my sponsors being Evans, Pritchard and Godfrey. And this, I think, gave rise partly to the belief that Evans, Pritchard and Godfrey were proselytizing for the church and brainwashing us, which was insulting. E.P. knew through Godfrey that I was going to be received, and he asked if I would like him to come along and sign the form as a sponsor, and I said that I would be honored. But I find it difficult to say exactly what pulled me to the Catholic Church. We Catholics would say it was the Holy Spirit, which outsiders would regard as a cop-out, but it wasn't E.P. or Godfrey. So I joined the church then.
You're still a Catholic?
Still
Practicing Catholic.
Very important. I had a long period, I don't know, should I digress now and go? That was in 1950, June 1950, and later on, 1954, which I'll describe later, when I was in the colonial service, I met Bernard Riley and decided to spend my life with him. And at that time, I was 31 years old. I had actually resigned from the colonial service and was going to try my vocation as a Catholic priest. I wanted to go back to South Africa, learn Zulu, and as a sort of reparations, really, become a priest in Zululand, and not to bring the message to the heathens, but to try and bear witness, really. And then I had the only time in my life I was seriously ill was, I think, the result of a inner tension between recognizing that I was gay, loving Bernard, and wanting to be a priest. And eventually I decided the right decision, I'm convinced, to go with Bernard. But at that time, because I was gay, I did not receive communion. The Catholic Church, as you know, still has major problems with homosexuality. So for 10 years or so I did not go. And eventually, when I returned to Ghana, I discussed this with a wise Catholic priest who was headmaster of a Benedictine school, and sitting on the terrace sipping whiskey at night, I told him about being gay, living with Bernard, and he said quite impatiently, well, don't you know that God made you and God loves you and you have no problem? I'll give you communion tomorrow and get me another whiskey.
Oh, nice.
Am I digressing too much?
No, that's lovely. Tell
so
me something about Bernard. Probably this is a good point to do.
About
Bernard.
Yes. Bernard, when I met him, was also in the colonial service. He was 3 years younger than I. He was teaching at Tanga High School. At that time there was no university in what was Tanganyika, later became Tanzania. But Tanga High School was the oldest in the country. It had been founded by the Germans. It was well set up with, I suppose, about half the staff being white, British, and with some Africans and Arabs. And it was the school which prepared people for university. And several of Bernard's students, he was teaching geography. He had done geography and geology honours at Manchester University. Like me, he had been in the forces during the war. He had been in army intelligence in India, what is now India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. And when I met him, I remember very clearly, at the Tanga Yacht Club one Sunday evening, we both liked sailing, and he came in. I'd heard about him. He'd been away to Dar es Salaam, and when he came in, when he sat down, that was it. I was bowled over. And he persuaded me. He said, I'm going to spend my life with you, which at that time, 1954, I had never imagined. And it wasn't easy. We had 6 months together in Tanga, and we had to be quite discreet, because although some men, including senior officials, had liaisons either with Africans, usually younger African women, or even African younger men, for two equals to be together was unacceptable. So, for example, we went, instead of going to the Tanga Club for the British films, we went to the open air India cinema, where we would be the only Europeans, and saw quite a few Bollywood films. One of them, On, became our sort of theme film, and I've only On, A-A-N, it was a major hit in 1952, and only last week Magnus, a young German friend of mine, found a copy for me, so I'm going to see it on DVD when I get back to South Africa. Bernard resigned at the end of his tour. He wasn't happy in the colonial situation, and very unimaginative Department of Education, and they gave him, which I think was very unfair, he had 1,700 papers, the GCSE equivalent papers in geography to mark, many of them in Kiswahili, which he wasn't, he could speak it, had good conversation Swahili, but he wasn't that good at it. And I remember spending a month with him in the evenings helping him, because my Swahili was good by then. I had passed the highest standard, going over the scripts and marking it. But for that and other reasons, Bernard enjoyed the actual teaching, he enjoyed his students, but he didn't like the colonial bureaucratic setup, and he decided to resign. We both went to England on leave and spent 6 months in London, and going around, he showed me his haunts in Manchester and showed me London, where he had spent a year on a teacher's training course. And then he went to what was then Rhodesia to accept a teaching post. I was obliged to go back to the colonial service. I had, as I said, unresigned to go to the church, and then I joined again, and I didn't want to flip-flop too much. So we decided that Bernard would go to Bulawayo in what was then Southern Rhodesia, where he taught at Founders High School, which was the only school for coloureds and Indians in the then Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland. So again he was preparing students for university. And after 9 months in Tanganyika, including a spell at Njombe in the Southern Highlands, where I was district commissioner for a time, and then Tunduru, Tunduru, in the southern Tanganyika, again I was district commissioner, which I liked. I think it was a great job. I loved the responsibility. I liked my colleagues. I liked dealing with the Africans. And I should say that Tanganyika was unusual. It wasn't a colony. It was a mandate of the United Nations, taken over. Britain had taken over the mandate under the League of Nations after World War I. Before World War I, it had been a German colony. So there was no heavy hand of colonialism, and also we knew that the end was coming. None of us thought it would be as quick as it was. And I can remember, of my 5.5 years in the colonial service in Tanganyika, I can remember few incidents that embarrassed or made me ashamed. There was one in Tunduru when the Liwali, the headman of the town, which was half a mile away, Liwali is L-I-W-A-L-I, a Muslim headman, came to me very politely, and it was the feast of Eid, and he asked if they could have the usual drumming, and I said, of course, why do you ask? And he said the wife of my predecessor, the district commissioner's wife, had said that drums gave her a headache and had forbidden them, and I still cringe at that. So I asked him in return if he minded if I joined them, and we had a great party. But there were I can honestly say there were few incidents of that sort. I had worried when people told me that as a district commissioner, if there was a hanging in my area, I would have to witness that. And I've always been strongly against capital punishment, and I didn't think I could do that. And fortunately that only happened at major centres, so it never arose. But otherwise, I'm proud of my service there. And going back to Oxford, it was John Beattie whom I met there.
What is the chronology? When was Oxford before this colonial service?
I'm sorry, I'm jumping about. Oxford was after Cambridge. I spent 2 years at Oxford.
Doing
I did a B.Lit. Baxter and Pocock and I all joined. At that time, EP discouraged anthropology as an undergraduate subject.
Yeah.
So we came in. Baxter and Pocock had both read English with F.R. Leavis at Cambridge, and I had read economics first of all, and then just part two of in anthropology. So we did B.Lit. I did a 20,000 word thesis on the Southern Nguni, I call them, the frontier wars of the Xhosa and the British in the 19th century, which is, I haven't reread it, but it would be embarrassing to read it because at that time I relied on sources such as Thiel, the main historian. There many more sources have since come to light. But as a result of that, the B.Lit was passed. Max Gluckman was my external examiner. And then
Who was your supervisor for that?
Godfrey, yes. And then at that time I hesitated between doing administration or going on with anthropology. And it was John Beattie, whom I met then, who was doing his DPhil at Oxford. He had spent 9 years in the colonial service and then come back to it. And he and Maya Fortes, whom I knew quite well, both advised me strongly if I was interested in administration to go for it. And they said, you can always come back into anthropology, which I did some years later. So then I applied for the colonial service. But to backtrack, under the Elsie Bellot Scholarship, I was supposed to go back to South Africa. By this time it was 1950, and the nationalist government had been in power for 2 years. They took over in 1948. I wrote to what was the Native Affairs Department in Pretoria, and they didn't want an English-speaking liberal with 3 university degrees, and they offered me a temporary clerkship in Pretoria at really quite a risible salary. And then I asked the trustees of the scholarship if I could fulfill my obligation by going to the colonial service, which they agreed to. First of all, under the influence of Godfrey and EP, I applied to the Sudan Political Service, and I had a very polite rejection, and they explained that at that time, this was 1950, Sudan became independent in 1955, and they told me informally it wasn't politically expedient to appoint a white South African. So I then applied for the colonial service and joined. I wanted to go out straight away to Tanganyika. I was by then 26 years old. I was impatient to start. I had done most of the courses, economics and anthropology and geography and history. The only thing I had not done was the language, Kiswahili, and the colonial service official was very supercilious, and he said, oh, you think you know everything? You have to do the year's cadet course. Fortunately at Oxford, it was the easiest year in my life until I retired. We didn't work hard. The language we liked. We had a gifted Arab teacher, Ali Ahmed Jahatmi, with whom I kept in touch, and we played village cricket and drank beer at the King's Arms and enjoyed. That stood me in very good stead later when I came back in 1960, asked if I could to do my DPhil, because I had to keep 6 terms at Oxford. So my B.Lit gave me 3 terms, and the Oxford Colonial course gave me another 3 terms at Wadham College, so I qualified. I hope that this isn't too confusing with jumping.
That's fine. Yeah. So you went out to the colonial service.
Yes.
Why did you finally leave it? Because of the same reasons as Bernard?
The same? No. I left it because of Bernard.
I see, yeah.
Basically because of Bernard. I wanted to join it. This was in 1956, and I remember saying to my contemporaries, that another reason was that I was convinced independence was coming. I had met Julius Nyerere in 1956 when I was District Commissioner in Njombe, and he came round with a delegation from TANU, the Tanganyika African National Union. He was little known then, but I gave a party for him, and he was one of the most impressive men I've met anywhere, politician or not. My mother was then staying with me. My parents had separated. My mother spent much of her time either staying with me or my brother or on her own. And I remember the way Nyerere, when he came to the room, saw my mother as the eldest person, went to her, sat down beside, and talked politely to her in a charming way. After that, I was reprimanded and told that as a district commissioner I shouldn't have encouraged a political party. But I'm glad I did it because, as I say, I did have quite a long talk to him. And that convinced me in what I had thought, that with a man like that, independence wouldn't be far away. I thought, 1956, I thought maybe 10 or 15 years. In fact, it was only 5 years, 1961. Thanks to Nyerere and to the governor, whom I knew too, Twining, I think helped the process a lot. So that was, I didn't want to be left, and I'd been thinking of this before I left Bernard, I didn't want to be left at age 40 or so with no career. And I thought...
What did you do then?
So Bernard was teaching in Bulawayo, and he made inquiries for me, and I went into another form of African administration, the City of Bulawayo African Administration, a big department headed by Hugh Ashton, himself an anthropologist. He had done a doctorate on what were then called the Basotho. He had also been in the colonial service in what was then the protectorate of Basotholand. And he was director, and I was given a job in the African townships. Very different from colonial service. It took me some adjusting to. I was given a Harley Davidson to drive around with, which I liked, but it took me some time to adjust from being a district commissioner, not because of pride, but I was a little king in the bush, and here I was part of a big hierarchy, and the city council, I was an employee of the city council, and we were subject to the whims of the white councillors, some of whom were liberal, some of whom were blatantly racist. So, but fortunately, because of Hugh Ashton's inspired and enlightened leadership, I think Bulawayo was one of it had the best housing in southern Africa, I'm convinced of that. And I worked in an innovative home ownership scheme where Africans were encouraged to own their own homes. The rent was deducted from their employers, so we didn't have this huge problem that all South African municipalities now have of rent arrears. It was paid simply to us. Money from the beer gardens went into building swimming pools and an arts centre, which I encouraged. So it was strangely, it was a good time, and looking back we were naively idealistic. Bernard at Founders High School was encouraged by the openings for his coloured and Indian students. He got them admitted he broke a lot of the bars, he got them admitted to the formerly whites-owned swimming bars and to the formerly whites-owned cinemas by shaming them and calling on the Constitution, which was supposed to outlaw discrimination. And we both felt we were doing good jobs, and we even thought we had a flat in town, we even thought of building a house. We had looked at a plot of land and we thought we could live our lives there. And then in 1958-59 the struggle for independence broke out, and we realized very soon that there was no place for us. Had we stayed, we would either have had to effectively join the revolution and be put in jail, or join the whites and been against it. So we decided to leave, and under the influence of an American professor and his wife, Bernard applied for a Fulbright scholarship and got a scholarship to Indiana University, where he did a PhD in geography, I wrote to Paul Baxter and said, what should I do? And he advised me to apply for a post in social administration at the University of Ghana, where Paul was teaching. I got the post, so we went our separate ways. And I taught in Ghana for 4 years. Fortunately, by conferences or taking leave, Bernard and I were able to meet at least once a year. In his third year at Indiana, Professor George Kimball, who was his supervisor, was asked to recommend somebody for a temporary post in geography at the University of Ghana. And he recommended Bernard, who was writing a thesis comparing natural resources in Ghana and Zambia. So Bernard joined me for a year. We shared a house, and otherwise we had a longish separation, which was painful, but I think in a relationship ultimately it strengthened it, because when we were together there were inevitably the few minor irritations, but when we were apart and came together again, we realized that this was our life, being together. And I think when finally we did in California come together forever, we were much stronger for it. Can I go on about Ghana?
Yes.
I taught for the 4 years a course in social administration, and these were about 25 men and women in the middle level civil service, as in social security, community development, healthcare, prisons, a variety of occupations, including a few from Cameroon, Nigeria, Togo, and they came for a 2-year course in social administration, highly motivated, because when they passed it was a barrier. They got better housing, they got an allowance for a motor car, which was very important, their salary increased. So as I say, they were highly motivated. They were mostly in their 30s and were a joy to teach, and they taught me a lot. And so this was my first experience of an independent country. This was 1959 when I went. Ghana had been independent 2 years earlier. I'd lived in Tanganyika, but that was, of course, under colonialism, and this was liberating for me. At the time there were a number of white South Africans. Once I went to Nigeria on a conference, and the 3 people representing the University of Ghana were all white South Africans, 2 of them who were exiles for political reasons, and there were a number of teachers and others about. But I felt at home immediately in Ghana, and although I haven't been back since 1988, I know if I step there tomorrow, it's like a second home to me. I taught some courses, as well as social administration. I taught some courses in the Department of Sociology, which housed some anthropologists, including Paul Baxter and Raymond Smith, who later went on to Chicago. And the head of department was a remarkable African American called St. Clair Drake, who had been one of the first black students in anthropology at the University of Chicago. And it was he who arranged for me to teach anthropology courses, and he arranged my teaching so that I could do field work. With Paul Baxter's guidance, I chose a community called Larteh, L-A-R-T-E-H, which is on the Akwapim Ridge, A-K-W-A-P-I-M, which is less than an hour's drive on the hills near Legon, near the university, so it was easy access. And I did teaching Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday, and then Wednesday afternoon I would drive to Larteh and come back on Sundays and have half a day at Labadi Beach to acclimatize, to get used to my other life. And that worked fairly well. It was an unorthodox way of doing field work, but I did that for about 3 years, plus spending time in the vacations when I could. And it may not have been ideal, but it suited me.
Why were you doing field work?
Sorry, I was doing field work because I wanted to join Bernard, and under the influence of our American friends in Rhodesia, we both knew that we had to have a PhD to get a decent post at an American university.
Yeah.
So I wrote to, as soon as I'd settled in Ghana, I wrote to Evans Pritchard, and EP encouraged me, and then I wrote to Sir Maurice Bowrer, who was the warden of Wadham College, and I said I'd like to come back, and I got back a letter which I treasure. I still have. It was about 3 lines. He said, "My dear Brokenshaw, Professor Evans Pritchard spoke about you, and that's quite all right. You can do whatever you like. The bursar will tell you how much to pay." And I compared that with Bernard, who was struggling through a variety of required courses at Indiana University in education and all sorts of subjects, whereas all I had to do was a dissertation. EP appointed Paul Baxter, who knew Ghana well, as my supervisor, and although Paul Baxter left after 2 years, he left the University of Ghana, he continued as my supervisor and was invaluable to me. And again, it was a question of setting an example, because since then I myself have supervised many students, and I often remember how helpful Paul Baxter was. He would send me weekly air letters, I would send him drafts, commenting, criticizing strongly, recommending books to read, recommending what not to do, what not to read, encouraging there all the time. And I know that's one of the most important functions of anyone who's at a university. Although certainly at some of the American universities, any form of teaching, I think, was sometimes undervalued in terms of research and publications. But Paul helped me, and then I did the research. It was a study of social change at Ghana, and at Late in Ghana. It was a good choice, it was a happy choice, because this was in 1960, Time magazine called it 1960 or 1961, the year of Africa. Africa was being discovered by America. There were a lot of interest by American institutions. Because of that, I was able to take 1 term's leave, which I spent on the west coast of America. I wanted to get a taste of what the USA was like, and I spent it, this was just a coincidence, at Western Washington College in Bellingham, Washington, where Bernard had spent the previous summer, quite coincidentally. But he left me his apartment when I got there, and I was able to spend some time with him at Indiana. And what I saw I liked very much at Washington, and I realized that Bernard and I could happily live at an American university. So I finished at Late, and I was saying it was a good choice because of the timing. It was a year of Africa. It was one of the first studies of a small town. Late had a population of about 6,000, including the people who lived in the surrounding villages. There had been many urban studies and more of the typical rural studies. I had hoped to do a study in the north of Ghana, like Jack Goody had done, but Paul Baxter sensibly pointed out it would be very difficult to get to. It was more than a day's drive from the south, so he persuaded me to go to Late, which was an inspired suggestion, because it was, one of the first small town studies, and it attracted a lot of attention, and also because my main thesis was that Late had suffered a lot of change with colonialism from the early 19th century, the impact of Christianity. The Basel Mission had built up one of the biggest churches in southern Ghana, the advent of cocoa, which Polly Hill had described from the 1870s, the cash economy, and the beginning of a globalization with Late spreading out. And until then, a lot of studies of social change had been of the things fall apart. The centre does not hold variety, saying with the coming of the West, all the old institutions collapsed and people the old traditions disappeared, and people, as Clifford Geertz described for Indonesia, the between two worlds, with the future always disappearing and the past receding, and they were between. Well, I found the opposite at Late, that they had this great capacity for adaptation and accommodation. And the result of that was that my book, I wrote up my dissertation, which was accepted at Oxford, and then published it under the title of Social Change at Late, Ghana. and it had, I checked recently, it received 22 reviews, most of them favourable. One French journal liked it, but they said it was, my French pronunciation isn't very good, trop de descriptif pour un lecteur français. So I've been accused of that in other circumstances of being too descriptive. And I would be the first to admit my strengths are not in detailed analysis. I'm a good ethnographer and describer, and I've got other achievements, but as I say, analysis is not top of the list. But for whatever reasons, it was well received, and more important to me, it was the people of Larteh loved it. Many of them could read English. I sent out many copies, and when I went back in 1970 on a visit, I was embarrassed to find the chief, Nana Asiedu, who was a good friend of mine, was holding an informal court. And he said, just wait a moment, greeted me while I finished this, and one of the elders produced my book and said, here it is, Brokenshaw, page 176. And it was very embarrassing. Other anthropologists have reported this reaction, that the printed word, although all I was doing was reporting what they told me, but it had all the authority of a sacred text. And that, at least, I more or less got it right, they thought.
You did a very long study of Larteh, didn't you? It continued after this period, did it?
Well, I went back. No, it really my study on which the dissertation was based was over a 3-year period. I did a long study, a joint study with Bernard when we were in Kenya, and that was about over 18 years of the Mberi in Kenya.
How do you spell
M-B-E-E-R-E, Mberi. So after, when I was at the University of Ghana, I met David Apter, political scientist, who'd done studies in Ghana and Uganda. He was from the University of California at Berkeley, and he ran the first ever Peace Corps training program for a group of 40 teachers to come out to Ghana under the Peace Corps. In the second year, in 1962, he invited me to direct this Peace Corps training program at the University of California at Berkeley. So that was my first time in California, and I was able to invite faculty. I invited Bernard, not just because he was my friend, but more importantly, he had spent a year in Ghana as a geographer, and he was qualified to teach about the geography of Ghana. And we ran the 6-week training course for the young teachers who were going out to Ghana. They were all university graduates, and they went out for a 2-year spell. As a result of that, David Apter suggested that I come to the University of California. He said rightly that I couldn't stay on in Ghana forever, and I did want to join Bernard, obviously, who was finishing his PhD. So the following year I had an appointment with Apter and Seymour Martin Lipset, who were directors of the International Institute of International Studies at Berkeley. I had an administrative post, so I stayed at Berkeley. Bernard was still at Indiana.
You say you had an administrative post?
Well, it was not an academic post.
Yeah.
I was an administrator. I was secretary and really administrator of the institute, which had a number of research grants. I arranged conferences. I did a couple of edited books. I built up African Studies department. I made sure the library had good holdings in African Studies, that sort of thing. Bernard was still working on his PhD at Indiana University. At this time my mother was getting frail, and she had joined me, so we had a house, a very pleasant house in Berkeley. Bernard joined us for all the vacations, the short and long vacations. He would come over. But after 3 years at Berkeley, Apter advised me to get an academic post, which I wanted to. at Berkeley there was no opening for me, partly because David Apter was persona non grata with the anthropologists for some reasons, which arcane reasons, and partly because they said they had people who covered, they had enough African anthropologists. So I applied at one of the other California universities at Santa Barbara, which is 2 hours north of Los Angeles, of UCLA. And they were a smaller campus. At first I had dismissed it in my mind as a surfing college, which it is. There's good surfing there, but it also is one of the better of the smaller colleges, and I was very happy there, and probably happier than I would have been at Berkeley, because we had a lot of freedom. Charles Erasmus, who was the first chairman, believed in letting people, after our introductory courses were covered, we could teach what we liked. He said that way the students would get good teaching. I succeeded Charles after 2 years as chairman. That was in 1969, and that was a year of increasing student protests against the Vietnam War. In our Department of Anthropology, we had hired a young anthropologist, archaeologist, to teach South American prehistory on a 2-year contract. He became very radicalized, and in his last year he said grades were capitalist emblems, and he was giving students A+ for a doll of a Vietnamese child bombed by the Americans. And so we did not surprisingly, we did not renew his contract after 2 years, but the students said that we had fired him, and particularly I as chair became the villain, and half the students signed a petition demanding that Bill Allen, the radical, be reinstated and that I be fired. And when Bernard and I were driving to campus one day, there was a huge banner which read, fuck Brokenshaw, which wasn't a very cheery welcome. And it was ironic because Bill Allen and I were probably the most radical in our department. We often found each other at rallies protesting against the war, but I worked, I think I always have, within the system. I try to change things from within. I don't believe in bringing everything tumbling down. But after that I was bruised. It was a difficult year, and I had full support from my colleagues and from some, not all the students. But I decided to go away, and Bernard encouraged me. Bernard by then had moved down to Santa Barbara. He'd got a post. It was ironic, when I left Berkeley, he was offered a post at Berkeley in what was one of the most prestigious departments in the USA of geography, with Carl Ortwin Sauer, whose brand of geography, human geography, was very congenial for Bernard. But in order to join me, he came down to Santa Barbara to join a much less significant department of geography, which was not congenial to him, and in fact after a couple of years he resigned from that, and in order to stay with me took a library degree. He did a 2-year Masters of Library Science in 1 year, and then there were no posts available and he was overqualified. The librarians found him threatening with all his degrees, and eventually he, which I'll come on to, he became a lecturer in the newly formed Department of Environmental Studies, which was formed in about 1974 after an oil spill in Santa Barbara galvanized people, made them more aware of the environmental hazards. And after Bernard had been in that department a year, I joined him. I was able, American universities are more flexible. I was able to get 50% time in anthropology and 50% in environmental studies, where Bernard and I taught a joint 3-quarter course on environmental problems of the Third World. Most of our colleagues concentrated on North America, with a bit about Europe and Japan, but they left most of the world, Africa, Asia, Latin America. They didn't deal with it. So we did that for until we retired in 1989, so it would have been about 10 years we taught together, which was a good experience. Quite difficult when you have personal and professional close relationships, but it worked out well. Bernard handled mostly the physical aspects, and I the social ones of the environment. Meantime, I was teaching, and it was a lot of emphasis on teaching. I taught courses on social change in Africa, on minorities, which started off with apartheid, and then I looked at discrimination across the world, blacks in Brazil, Muslims in what was then Russia, the untouchables, Dalit in India. There were many candidates, and it was a good education for me as well. I also taught from the beginning a graduate course on development. And it was odd, at this time when I started, I think I was one of the few who taught such a course, probably in the world. And now any university, certainly in Britain, would have something like that. And it was interesting that my colleagues, not all of them understood my interest, but they supported me. We had, under the influence of Charles Erasmus, the first chairman, he had encouraged us to tolerate each other. I thought one of my colleagues was too much an armchair anthropologist and should go out in the field. I'm sure some of them thought I was quaint, not only for my interests, but in a department of 20 there were only two other foreigners. There was a Mexican, Macfarlane, and an archaeologist, Brian Fagan. I was the only practicing Christian as a Catholic of the group, and I was the only gay in the department. So I think it says a lot that some people have the idea that America and American institutions are so rigid and doctrinaire and fundamentalist, but I found a great acceptance of diversity, certainly in this environment. And many of my students, most of whom I'm still in touch with, many of my students went into either to teach development at universities or to posts in the World Bank or Oxfam or something development related. And this was at a time when academic jobs were scarce. And that's one reason, of course, for the growing popularity of development. The other is an increased awareness that anthropology does have a contribution to make. At the same time, I was a director for 25 years of a non-profit Institute for Development Anthropology with two American anthropologists, Michael Horowitz and Thea Scudder from the California Institute of Technology, and Horowitz from State University of Binghamton, New York. And as I say, for 25 years we were a missionary enterprise in a secular way. We were trying to persuade the World Bank and the United States Agency for International Development and other bodies that development projects were more likely to succeed if they asked people like us. And we had a roster at its height of 400 anthropologists, many of whom came from developing countries, who were available for consultancies and advice. The United States Agency for International Development, I think in 1978, introduced a requirement that all projects had to have a social soundness analysis. Before that, they'd have to have an environmental analysis, which was accepted. The social analysis was resisted by the economists and the lawyers who tend to still to dominate world development, but accepted, and the results showed that the projects were much more likely to succeed. Ideally, anthropologists should be involved right at the beginning in drawing up the program, during the program, in monitoring it, afterwards in evaluating, and it's very seldom that we've been able to have this follow through from beginning to end. But after spending my professional lifetime in this field, I'm convinced that of the righteousness of our cause, and I think slowly more and more agencies are accepting. The USAID at one time had employed 60 anthropologists, but unfortunately many of them became bureaucrats willy-nilly. They became sucked into the system, seldom spent time in the field. The director, when I left, of USAID was not an anthropologist, but had been a Peace Corps volunteer. He'd spent 2 years teaching in Peru. So this makes an enormous difference. As I say, so many Americans are quite insular and have little idea of abroad. So there was a breath of fresh air coming in through us and Peace Corps volunteers and so on.
Is there more you'd like to say about development anthropology? Because I know it's your main field of interest, or is that...
Yes, well, just briefly, as I said, there was some, I found less so in the USA than in Britain. In Britain, some leading anthropologists remained skeptical. In fact, I went in 1982 to 1984. I spent in London as director of the University of California Student Exchange Program. We have about 200 students in 15 universities in the UK and Ireland. And Isaac Shapira encouraged me to get an affiliation with LSE, just so I could use the library and attend seminars and so on. And I was told at a meeting to discuss this, I was going to be an honorary fellow or whatever they called it, there was some objection, not to me personally, but because I was known to be doing development. And did we really want to do development? But anyway, I was accepted, and I met no personal animosity. But it seemed to me quaint then, still does. I would say, personally, for me, it's been a fulfilling, being able to help in various projects, if nothing, making the impact less harsh than it would have been. I mean, this seems like a lame excuse, but for example, in resettlement, my colleague Ted Scudder is probably the world expert on the forced resettlement of people, particularly as a result of man-made dams. I mean, the numbers run into the millions. The Three Gorges Dam in China alone displaced 1.5 million. Scudder was involved in that from the beginning with the Canadian contractors, and through him more provision was made for the people. Their lives are still miserable. They've been disruptive. They've been relocated, but more provision had been made for services, for schools, for a number of other things to make that relocation more difficult. We're not just band-aid people, though I do believe that we have had some influence on the policies, which is the important part of World Bank and others. The World Bank was lucky in having as their chief sociologist for many years is a Romanian Michael Cernia, who recently retired, CERNEA. He wrote a book called Putting People First, and he really believes in this, and he's been responsible, with some prodding from us, in recruiting many anthropologists to senior positions in the World Bank. So I would say I'm proud of that things have changed a little. Some anthropologists, Arturo Escobar is one, James Ferguson, former student of mine, another, are very skeptical about development, and their line seems to be that development is fundamentally disruptive, and fundamentally it's wrong. Many of the people like Escobar come from a rather left-wing Marxist point of view. Development is run by capitalists, for capitalists, better to have nothing to do with it. That hasn't been my line. Going back to Rhodesia, I mean, the government, even before Ian Smith, was fairly racist, but we worked within it, Bernard and I, in our different ways, to make some changes within. So I've always been a gradualist. I'd like to say something about the other field work. And
yes.
As a result of wanting to go abroad, I accepted a post in Kenya as an area evaluator, it was called, for a special rural development program. This was a program run in 6 different areas of Kenya, chosen to be representative. The area where I went to, and I asked for it, was low potential, and it was near the Tana River. Parts of it were semi-arid. I asked to be sent there because I knew there would be no African sociologist or political scientist who would want to go to this bleak area, and it was familiar to me from Handeni, where I'd been stationed in Tanganyika, quite similar, and I like these marginal areas.
Sounds Handeni spelled?
Handeni. So I went there, and fortunately Bernard was able to take leave and I spent 15 months there the first time. He spent 9 months with me, and while he was there he suggested, I was then evaluating, I was employed by the government of Kenya and the University of Nairobi to do an evaluation. I won't go into the details of the program. There were some successes, but again it wasn't adequately planned. They made mistakes such as wanting the few pastoralists in the area to form communal ranches. Nobody asked the pastoralists. Nobody took advantage of this great wealth of indigenous knowledge that they have. So the group ranches, of course, failed, as they always do. But apart from that, personally it was a great experience for us, and at Bernard's suggestion we applied to do a joint study of social and ecological change in this Mberi division of Kenya. And we were able to get a National Science Foundation grant, well, 2 grants in fact, and we came out for 2 periods of about a year each in the 1970s. And then we went back again whenever we could in the 1980s. So over an 18-year period we monitored the changes, and we focused on changes in vegetation, because at the beginning we noticed, because the people told us, that deforestation was occurring at quite a rapid rate. For a number of reasons. Partly the population was growing, so fields were being cleared for crops. Partly because under the development program, charcoal production was encouraged, and this meant that the hardwoods were being cut down. I remember once Bernard and I he was photographing a man who was chopping down a hardwood tree near a stream, and he looked at us and he said, "I know what you're thinking." He said this in Swahili, "but who will, if I don't chop down the tree, who will feed my children? Who will feed my children? Will you?" I mean, he making the point that he had no other way of getting cash. He knew it was environmentally degrading, and that taught us a lesson, not to be too disapproving. But we did, and we published a 2-volume book. One was a botanical dictionary, which Bernard did, of all the trees. He was a geographer and became a self-taught botanist. We were very impressed by the indigenous knowledge. This was my introduction really to indigenous knowledge of the people. We would go around with schoolboys and schoolgirls, and in walking, at first all I would see is a forest, trees, and they would say, "There we are, Mr. David, you are asking about that tree," and they would point, and all I would see were trees, and they'd say, "Come on," and they would show me, "This is a tree which is good for when you have a cut or to make a chair or whatever use it was." And the old men knew even more, and the women knew a great deal about firewood. And we became instant pioneers in what was called social forestry. In 1975, Eric Ekholm wrote a book called The Other Energy Crisis. The main energy crisis was oil, of course, in 1974, but the other energy crisis was the deforestation, the disappearance of woodlands. So this became, the vegetation became it was a neat focus of our work, how the houses were no longer made of wood, but they were roofed with corrugated iron. How when we first went there, a lot of the old people were dressed in skins, and nearly all the household utensils, instruments, weapons were made from the trees. And within our period of study, that all disappeared. The forestry department's response again was to encourage communal woodlots, which seldom work, because the assumption here, which I've been fighting all my professional life, is that out there is a community which is cooperative. And this, of course, was the main reason for the collapse of Nyerere's Ujamaa program, which was founded on the belief that people are cooperative. They're not. I mean, they'll cooperate within a small family group or one based on religion, but a village is seldom. There are always feuds and factions. And also, when woodlots were established, very often the women did all the work, were expected to, of watering them and guarding them and weeding them. But when it came to selling them, the men expected to get the results. So we, in and out of season, Bernard and I were encouraging the foresters to ask the local people what they wanted, what they knew about trees. One example is of one tree it was a Melia volcensis, which we had seen growing in straight rows, obviously planted by local farmers. And we asked one of the foresters, who in fact was a British forester left over from colonial days, who was very snooty, and he said, oh, it's far too difficult to germinate. So they were planting easy trees like eucalyptus and pines, which the local people didn't like, weren't much good to them. So we asked an old man who had a row of 20 Melia, and we said, how do you plant these? And he was very scathing. He took a pinch of snuff and he said, I'm surprised. I thought you white people knew everything. Every Karithi is an uncircumcised boy. It's a very insulting thing. Every Karithi knows that. You follow the goats around. The goats eat the seed from the marah, and the enzymes do the work, and then you plant the excreted seed. And we told the forester that. I don't think he believed us. But they could easily have done. They could easily have collected these and planted the Melia, which is a multi-purpose tree. It provides shade. The goats eat the fruit. It's a good hardwood tree for building. And compared to eucalypt, it's 10 times better. So as a result of that, in 1980, I co-edited with Mike Warren, an American friend of mine, whom I had first met when he was a Peace Corps volunteer. I taught him. And he was very much interested in indigenous knowledge, and we edited a book called Indigenous Knowledge and Development in 1980. And this was one of the first of that sort. We had a collection of people, many of whom came under the influence of Robert Chambers at Sussex. I had known Robert in Kenya working on the Special Rural Development Program, and he brought in 6 or 7 writers, and we wrote about a range of instances where indigenous knowledge never supplemented Western knowledge, but where it was a very useful add-on to work that any development should be worked on both. We had some difficulty persuading not only the World Bank people but African scientists. One Kenyan had spent some years at Utah State and came back with a PhD in agriculture, very high tech. And when I talked to him about indigenous knowledge, he laughed and he said, David, you think I must go back and ask my illiterate old grandmother? And I said, exactly. But I don't think I convinced him.
Okay, so you retired in 1989, but I'm sure you didn't stop doing all the things that you've been doing before.
No, I retired in 1989, and we decided to move to England, having spent 2 years there with the education with our Californian exchange students. Bernard, although he'd been born in England, had spent all his life outside. I'd only known England in my student years at Cambridge and Oxford. But those 2 years showed us a different England where we thought we'd like to go. And also Bernard had been a lecturer. He was not entitled a temporary year-to-year lecturer. He was entitled neither to a pension nor to health care. And he already had some health problems, so we thought it would be better to move to England where he could use the National Health Service. I should say that by 1995, the University of California, it was a great boon to us, allowed me to put Bernard as, it's a clumsy phrase, a same-sex domestic partner. They said, had we been together more than 2 years, and I said, what about 40 or whatever it was, and they allowed me to put him on my medical aid, which made a great difference, and also he was on the pension had he survived me, which he did not. So we spent 10 years in Britain, during which we, sometimes together, sometimes I on my own, gave talks at universities in Finland and Germany and Crete, and a few in England. I was active for some time with people like Sandra Wallman in the group on applied anthropology, attended seminars when they were of interest, particularly at SOAS and LSE, but not heavily involved. Bernard and I had decided when we retired that we wouldn't stick to our respective disciplines but explore the world. So we did a lot of traveling to far distances. We went to Europe many times. We went in England. We did a lot of traveling. We went to we did a lot of culture, opera, concerts, plays, and enjoyed. So I can't say that it wasn't unlike, I was by no means a Firth who remained producing an article a week, it seemed, until he was 100. And then in 1999 we went to South Africa, again for Bernard's health. He had problems, heart bypass, and we decided it would be better to go to South Africa, which we had visited together several times. I'd always hoped, although I'd despaired at times, of coming back to my native South Africa. I am fourth generation South African. I feel I belong there. So we settled at Cape Town in Fishhook and lived there together for 5 years, and then Bernard died mercifully very quickly. We had lunch 2 days before he died, and then he died peacefully 2 years ago after a stroke. I will stay on there. He knew he was dying, and Bernard told me, don't mope, make a life, get on with your own life, and that's what I'm doing now. I'm on my way around the world. I do remain somewhat involved. Martin West and Muggsy Spiegel, who of the University of Cape Town, arranged for me to be an honorary professor in the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of Cape Town. It's a very good small department. Owen Sichoni, my Zambian colleague, is very active in development. Occasionally I talk to his class if he's away, but otherwise I attend seminars, try to look wise, and enjoy the contact with the young. I find it a stimulating department where they often discuss issues which they should, I think, in South Africa, such as health and AIDS and poverty and housing and race. It's curious, I think there's some tiptoeing around the whole subject, the whole topic of race in South Africa. Because of those apartheid years, people are afraid of being labelled a race. Even if you point to some obvious social differences between black and white, you have to be very careful how you phrase it. But despite that, I much enjoy it. I go in once for the weekly seminar, and I think the piece I did on Monica Wilson will be my last publication. I don't feel the need, or I don't have anything more to say on that.
Well, you've had a very, very full life, and it's been fascinating listening. You touched on a number of people who earlier on in my life also influenced me, and I wondered whether we could just end by you giving a few words or pen portrait of one or two of them, perhaps starting with Evans Pritchard, who you mentioned was the most influential person in a way in your life, or at least academic influence. What sort of man was he, and what sort of mind was he?
Well, I found I seldom had long discussions about anthropology with him. When we came out together, when we travelled on the Union Castle liner from Britain to South Africa in 1951, he and I would often end up standing on deck, and he would talk about and I encouraged him about his early days in Egypt and his wartime period in Cyrenaica, which I loved, and I could listen to that a long time. We would talk together about whatever interested. He knew he was just I've heard other people say he was difficult, he was arrogant. I found him none of those things. He was always encouraging. I think there was the link which I mentioned, that his wife was South African. He hated the apartheid government, and it was difficult for him with his wife's family because his father-in-law had been a High Commissioner for South Africa in London. But he liked South Africa. I found him forthright and encouraging, and then shortly before his death, Bernard and I exchanged houses from Santa Barbara and spent a summer in Oxford. And he was beginning to fail then, and we would often meet him in the
1970s.
In the early 1970s. I think he died in 73,
yes.
So it would have been about 71. And we would meet him at the Randolph or one of the pubs, and he was drinking more than he should. And Bernard was very good with him. He would say, "Come on, let's have another drink." And Bernard would say, "No, come on, EP, off we go. We'll go home," which I couldn't possibly have said to him, but he was docile and he would go. He met Bernard early on. I took him to meet him, and there was never any problem. I wouldn't have expected any. I think he knew before I did that I was gay, and he was very fond of Bernard and encouraged us. I enjoyed also walking around the parks with him. Whenever I visited Oxford, he'd say, "Come on, we walk around the parks." So I found him, as I say, I can't add anything to him as an anthropologist, but as a warm human being, he was wonderful.
But you mentioned a rather nice incident when you knew Polly Hill, and Polly was at a dinner party and heard that EP was coming out.
This was at the when the University of Ghana was celebrating its independence as a university, instead of being a university college, and EP had been rather sidelined in favour of all the East Europeans who were coming out, and he was quite disgruntled, rightly, because he had made more of a contribution, and he wasn't in a mood for serious talk, and at dinner Polly Hill kept on badgering him about what he really thought about so-and-so, and EP was countering with light talk about the birds in the Sudan, pretending he'd understood. And eventually he turned to me and said, "David, who is this impossible woman you put next to me?" Which I'm afraid Polly heard.
It was in his deaf ear as well.
Yes, yes.
Okay, well, moving on to another, the next brother, so to speak, in the famous three brothers, Meyer Fortes. Did you know Meyer?
Quite well, yes. He was not as easy for me to get to know as EP, but very encouraging to me as a South African. It might be worth mentioning that when I was a graduate student at Oxford, there were 6 chairs of social anthropology in Britain, and 3 of them were held by South Africans. Schaap at LSE, Max at Manchester, and Meyer at Cambridge a bit later when he left to go to Cambridge. And it was Meyer, whom I mentioned, who was very sympathetic to my vacillating between administration and anthropology, and he and John Beattie encouraged me. In fact, Meyer arranged for me to be interviewed by Sir Roger Firth, who was head of the Colonial Service, and obviously said, "This is a good chap, look after him," because he gave me an easy time and gave me my first choice of country, which was Tanganyika, because of John Beattie. I had decided I wouldn't go to Kenya because the Mau Mau there were signs that it was going to begin, and I didn't want to get involved after South Africa in another black versus white conflict.
The other Africanist who you got to know quite well was Lucy Mayer.
Yes, Lucy I didn't know so well, but I admired her. I'd had dinner with her a few times, and she was important as a pioneer in social administration, in applied anthropology. I think she had a difficult time because of this, as a woman too. It wasn't easy in those days. But the little I saw of her, she was always most encouraging, and she was a model in a way, for she got on. She seemed to get on well. When she went out to the colonies, they were then with Africa, she was outspoken and sensible, I thought. And I was very pleased when the Royal Anthropological Institute instigated the Lucy Mayer Medal for contributions to applied anthropology, and I regard this as one of my achievements. I nominated my colleague Thea Scudder for the first, and he was a very strong contender, and he got it, and he couldn't come to Britain, so I was able to present it at a professional meeting in Tucson, Arizona. He well deserved it.
The other woman, Africanist, who I got to know a bit and you must have known, was Audrey Richards.
Yes, Audrey I got to know in a short time quite well. She came to Ghana for something or other, and I was then working at Latte. I wasn't at the university, it must have been in a vacation, and she asked if she could come out, and she spent 5 days with me, and it was wonderful and shaming to go round with her. And I've had this experience with several anthropologists, partly in Kenya, particularly in Ghana. It was only a 45-minute drive from the university, and whenever any visiting anthropologists came, I suggested that rather than talk at Legon, they come to Latte and we'd walk round. So EP came, Aidan Southall came, Charles France, many, and every time in walking around with them they would say, "Who's that? Why is he or she doing that? Who lives there?" And Audrey was the most searching of all. I kept a notebook of things, I'd seen every day and hadn't noticed or hadn't thought to ask.
It was a wonderful anthropology.
And she also, I had working with me then a young German, Agnes Klingschön, who was doing her masters on children at Larteh. And she'd got stuck, as many of us do, in field work and was very depressed. And Audrey really sorted her out and made her see that she knew a great deal. Agnes was feeling she knew nothing. And as a result of that, Agnes stayed on and did a doctorate of women at Larteh. And Audrey was just marvellous with her. And then my last meeting, as it were, with Audrey, I was in London and came here to King's College for her memorial. And sat next to a young man who was one of her villagers, English villagers, and it was wonderful hearing him talk about her.
Oh, that's lovely anecdotes. Well, there's so many more, but I think...
Could we talk Shap?
Shap, yes.
Briefly about Shap. I met Shap when I was in Rhodesia. He was friendly with Hugh Ashton in Bulawayo. He came out every summer for a couple of months and stayed with the Ashtons. He encouraged me to write a history of Rhodesia, which I started on, but it was hopeless. I never finished it. And then when Bernard and I lived in London in the 1990s, I had a ritual. Jean Lafontaine explained it to me. I would go to the White House at 5 o'clock, phone and say, "It's David," and he would say, "Come up." I'd usually bring him a bottle of whiskey or whatever else he wanted, and we'd chat and have a drink or two until 6, and then I'd say, "It's time for the news," and we would leave. And that was very important. I think he enjoyed it. I did. It was once a month or so. And very often we invited him to lunch at our flat in Kennington. And he didn't like too big a group, but 6 or 8. And he enjoyed his few whiskies, a little frail. But again, he was one who encouraged me, and particularly when I was younger and starting on this. I think we all need a boost in confidence. And I've been lucky in meeting people like that.